So welcome to the Carbon Community Project Day. If we had been doing this face-to-face, we would have just travelled for about an hour and a half up the beautiful Heart of Wales line. You can see the viaduct on the line in the background. And we would have arrived here at the Carbon Community Project site near Llandovery. So the Carbon Community Day is all about two themes. It's all about trees and it's all about carbon. And if we think about the bigger picture of this field module, looking at landscape, heritage, community and environment, this is a really nice project because it brings all of those themes together at this brand new site where they're going to be creating a forest over the next few years. So we're going to head up into the site and meet some of the team that have made the Carbon Community Project.
So we set up a new charity called the Carbon Community, and the reason for that was we started looking at carbon offsets in particular and got very uncomfortable with the way that offsets work. It's almost a greenwashing exercise where companies can sort of say, yeah, we're green, honest believers, we really are. But the reality is, of course, is that what we need two big things really to help. We need to take more carbon dioxide out of the air, and we all need to change our behavior. It's a combination of those two things that have to happen. So just thinking about how do we take carbon dioxide out of the air? Well, we started looking at this and came to the conclusion that nature-based solutions were probably the right way to go. And of those, the most effective is actually nature's solution, which is trees. And of course, humanity has cut down many trees. And in fact, this whole area behind me here would originally have been trees, a lot of it oakland. And they've all been cut down. So long story short, we started researching the question, okay, well, if we were to put trees in, then what would it take to maximize carbon capture? And despite the fact that scientists have been working on that question for about 30 years, remarkably, we still really don't have a proper answer to what does it take to maximize carbon capture in a tree. And the reason that it's complicated is because we tend to look at the tree as the bit that we can see. But 75% of the carbon is actually stored in the ground and not in the tree itself. And most of the science has been above ground. So we can tell you very accurately how much carbon is in a tree by looking at its type, and we apply a formula and we know how tall it is and what the girth of the trunk is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can say, okay, well, it contains this amount of carbon, but we don't know what's happening below ground. And below ground is really a story about biodiversity. And so we set up the charity really to plant trees, and this site's about 170 acres. And it's divided effectively into two things, one of which is a scientific experiment to look at different nature-based solutions. And the second of which is we're creating a new native woodland here, which people can come and enjoy, and ultimately will also capture carbon for many generations to come. The charity has been going about a year and a half, and this is this land we've owned about a year. The reason it's a charity is actually because one of the problems with carbon capture projects is land security. And there are many projects which happen around the world, in Madagascar and all the rest of it, looking at mangrove swamps and all these sorts of things. And one of the things that you find when you talk to people involved in these projects is that they have problems where local folk may not necessarily like these people coming in planting trees, and maybe they even cut the trees down and put in a crop or something like this. Or maybe you've got poachers happening or all sorts of other things, or government regime change, which causes land security issues. So in thinking about a scientific project, it became very clear that, first off, that there are many scientific techniques that get stuck in the labs. There is a lack of field trial capability where scientists can take the techniques they know work in the lab and scale them up so they know that they will work at field scale, literally, where that you could then roll this out and get it into the sort of wider community of everybody planting trees. So as a result of that, we concluded that a charity structure was the right way to do it, because the charity always owns the land and would always be protected by the charitable objects, which mean that this will always be here and this will always be a community forest that can be used for scientific research. When we were looking at where, that there are a combination of different factors, right? One of which is actually you want a reasonable amount of water. And as you can see behind me, it's quite a wet day today, and we have plenty of water here in Wales. It's also a very beautiful part of the world, actually, too. But the other main place for growing trees is Scotland, and those are the two big sort of growing areas. The challenge with Scotland is its accessibility to a lot of people. A lot of the population is in the south in one form or another. And we as Carbon Community also want to involve people in nature and environmental science and environmental research. So actually down south was important. So Wales is the obvious location. It's also one of the locations where if you look at all the modelling around climate change and what's going to happen to our planet and our country in the coming years under various different scenarios, this will stay warm and wet and therefore a great place for growing trees, whereas, for example, the southeast, much less so. So communities are really important because, and there are different communities which are fundamentally involved in this project. It's important because everybody around this in the local area needs to basically be bought into the project, what we're doing. If everyone is sort of angry and upset and, all the rest of it, and farmers, obviously, there's a lot of change going on in farmland at the moment, as in particular as the European subsidies come to an end and the government is bringing in a new subsidy scheme which encourage, acts which help nature or, and as a result of that, a lot of change going on. So for us here, part of the objective is to make sure that the local community are bought into what we're doing and understand what we're doing and see it as a positive thing, which I think is the case. There's also scientific community as well. And this is important. This is about providing field trial areas for university and environmental researchers to come and test out new things. That's very important too. And then that behavior change I talked about earlier on, that's important too as well, to get one of the best ways of getting people to actually change behaviors, rather than me saying, change your behavior, you must change your behavior. It's not going to happen, right? But actually, if people can come along and get involved and put trees in the ground and contribute to the science and measure things, it's probably going to have much more of a lasting impact. And in particular, we focus that on young people. We think it's very important that young people kind of really get grounded in nature, the environment, biodiversity, and that's very much in line with, of course, the Welsh Government and Future Generations Act too. We have there's a 170-acre site, about 28 acres or 11 hectares or so. We have dedicated to field trials, and what we are doing is we're running a massive A/B test of nature-based solutions, and we're testing different things in a series of test cells, and then we're replicating those test cells 8 times. And we do that so we get statistical confidence in the results. And the reason that's important is because even just around me in these different fields, there are little microclimates and the water's slightly different and all those sorts of things. So we need to replicate what we do in such a way that we can get confidence that actually we've got really careful science going on and we get a robust result. The 28 acres or thereabouts is we're testing several different concepts. First of all, we're trying to cover the age-old debate about conifer versus broadleaf trees, right? This is a big one, right? If you look at the commercial part of forestry, it's all conifer because they want lots of tall, straight trees, right? Without lots of knots that grow very, very close together, and then they can harvest them after 30 or 40 years. And timber production is really important. I mean, we need timber for buildings, timber here. Increasingly, we should be using more timber in our buildings anyway, because it's a great carbon store, rather than building things out of cement, which is creating a lot of carbon dioxide. So we need a timber industry that works well. The UK currently imports around more than 80% of its timber, and yet we have the capacity and the land and the capability to grow trees. We grow much more of that in our own capability. But conifers aren't necessarily popular. People don't like them because a conifer forest is densely planted and it's impenetrable. It's that impenetrable forest thing where you can't really get in and enjoy it. And people love broadleaf A broadleaf, a mixed broadleaf forest restoration, if you like, is much more nature friendly, right? The monoculture of a conifer stand does not help nature. And we know biodiversity is very much closely linked with carbon capture. So one of the things that we're looking at is what is the true carbon capture impact of monoculture versus a mixed broadleaf environment. And that's really important, right, to understand that. Because if you go and look at forest research, which is part of the Forestry Commission, and the research which is published today, they'll tell you that faster growing trees capture more carbon. And they're right, they do in the short term, right? But if you then cut them down, what impact does that have? And that's only looking above ground. What's happening below ground? All of those bugs and beetles and fungi that exist in ancient forests, they don't necessarily exist in a modern day conifer stand. And those bugs, beetles, and bacteria are critically important for breaking down all the stuff that drops from leaf mold and dead animals and all the rest of it in a magical process into what we know of as soil. If you ever sat and thought about where soil comes from, it comes from all that stuff, and it's a complicated process of breaking it all down into things which then become soil, which provides nutrients for trees to grow. It's also really important part of capturing carbon in the soil, and that's where 70% of the soil is. So the second technique that we're using is to take soil from ancient woodland and plant it into the planting hole. We put the tree in the ground. And what we're doing is we're actually transplanting biodiversity from ancient woodland into our new forest creation. Now, we know in the labs this works really well. The trees have a better survival rate, they grow faster, and in particular, the mycorrhizal fungi, which has a symbiotic relationship with the tree, provides the tree essential nutrients to grow, and then the tree in return provides its sugars back. So we're transplanting ancient soil from ancient woodland into the trees to help them grow. If you look at a piece of ancient 1 meter by 1 meter, 1 meter square piece of ancient woodland, there are more than 60,000 different types of beetles, bugs, and bacteria in that 1 meter square. That doesn't exist in a modern conifer plantation. So we're mixing conifer and broadleaf, and then we're saying, well, with and without this injection of mycorrhizal fungi. The third technique that we're using is we're then applying basalt. Now, crushed basalt is a waste product, if you like, of mining. And yet there is a really interesting property in this basalt, in that when it rains, as it is at the moment, the basalt begins to break down. So it breaks down from rock into dust and into the underlying chemicals in the basalt. And the rainwater helps it do that. And in rainwater, what you find is you've got, it allows carbon to be captured as the basalt breaks down. And this is really potentially quite significant. This has been tried in sugar beet and peas, and you can see 5 to 8 tons of carbon being captured for every hectare, which is a significant amount, right? So what we're doing is we're applying basalt onto both the broadleaf and the conifer trees to then test what impact does this have. Does this capture carbon in the soil? Yes. Does it also then capture carbon from the basalt breaking down, which ultimately from the atmosphere, which then soaks away into the groundwater, turning into calcium carbonate or limescale, stuff you find in the bottom of your kettle? And do the nutrients from the basalt as it breaks down help the trees to grow and ultimately increase tree survival rates? One of the first things we're going to be looking at. And if that's not enough, then there is potentially a combinatorial effect. We don't know, but there are strong hints in science that actually the basalt helps the mycorrhizal fungi grow better. It feeds the mycorrhizal fungi, which feeds the tree, which gives the mycorrhizal fungi sugars, which ultimately then helps it to digest more basalt. So we're really trying to test a combination of different things to see what does it take to maximize carbon capture. So one of those treatments, we're putting this stuff down, which is crushed basalt. This is a waste product from mining. It's quite finely ground. It's very wet today, so it's just making a sort of mucky mess. And basically this begins to break down to then release essential chemicals, nutrients, for the trees, and doing so capture carbon as well. And we've applied this at a rate of 40 tonnes per hectare onto some of the fields. And in order to then be able to measure the effect of this, what we need to do is we need to see what happens to the groundwater. Because as this breaks down, it breaks down into calcium and carbonate, and we can see that by taking samples of groundwater. And the groundwater will then tell us in the lab exactly what's in there. And because we have control groups, we'll then be able to see and say, okay, well, this is the difference this is created. That allows us to measure the carbon that is captured. We can then also see over time whether the trees that are treated with the basalt do better. Do they have a better survival rate, for example, which is critically important commercially, but it's also really important environmentally too. And do they grow faster or not? In theory, they should, because as this breaks down, this has nutrients which don't exist in traditional fertilizers. Things like silicon and calcium and some of those sorts of nutrients, which in fields like these around us have often been depleted after many, many years of farming. So let's talk about how we take a water sample from the field. We've got a couple of key pieces of equipment here. This is a sample bottle. It's got a piece of tubing on it, and this is a vacuum pump. This is a rechargeable vacuum pump that allows us to basically create a vacuum in the bottle, which then creates a vacuum in the lysimeter tube, which then encourages the water out of the ground at root depth into the lysimeter, and we can then suck it up using a vacuum into the sample bottle. And that's how we take samples. So I came up last night and I created a vacuum in each of these lysimeters, and hopefully they will have collected water underground in the little collection pocket at the bottom. So now the job is to basically extract the water. So what we're going to do is we're going to connect the vacuum up again to the vacuum bottle. Hopefully water will come in, and then we'll be able to take a sample. We'll record a sample in one of these sample tubes, and that will go off to the lab where they'll measure exactly what's in it. That's the theory. Now let's see whether we can actually make it work. Okay, here we go. As we connect this to the vacuum pump, which we've got here, and there's a little tube slot here with vacuum written on it. We'll put that in there like that. So that's going to create the vacuum, and then this here is this fine clamped off tube basically goes down to the lysimeter, which actually connects the water 40 centimeters under the ground. So we take this tube and we wedge it into the top of the bottle. Okay, so I've come back about 5 minutes later, and we've got a little bit of water connected in the bottle there. So what we're going to do is pop that in one of the samples and send that off to the lab, and we're good to go. And let's hope we've got some bicarbonate and some calcium that we can detect.
So as we discussed in the introduction, if you think about the kind of range of ways that we have to capture carbon and lay it back down where it needs to be in the biosphere and in the soil, trees are kind of our trump card. They take carbon and they lay it down and they keep it for a long time, as long as they're not harvested and removed. And this project is all about trying to use trees to restore carbon back into the soil. So before we get started on the nitty-gritty, I want us to think about why we have arrived at this point in our planet's history of facing a climate emergency and what the kind of observations about our planet tell us. So if we think back to kind of what the temperature of the planet was looking like in 2015 and 2016, we were becoming used to having anomalous years where we were told the global average temperature at the surface of the Earth is warmer than it's ever been at any point in the last 100 years. It's the warmest year on record. But we were used to seeing those real anomaly years generally in 1998 and then again in 2017, in years when we were expecting things to be a little bit warmer because As well as the greenhouse gases rising in the atmosphere, it was an El Nino year. It was a year in which the Pacific was in its warm phase, and we tended through the 2000s and through lots of history actually in the instrumental period to get anomalously globally warm years in El Nino years. What happened in 2019 and 2020 was it was the first time that we were seeing years which were the warmest year on record, but actually not only were they not an El Nino year, they were a La Nina phase. The Pacific was in its cool phase, so they should not have been anomalously warm anyway. And we reached a point where the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were so high and the global average temperature of the Earth was rising so much that we were actually, the La Nina years weren't helping us. And for a lot of people, 2019 and 2020 in particular have been these years of realising that we were at a point where avoiding dangerous climate change was becoming hard to do. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say that we need unprecedented changes at a rate and scale not seen before in every sector of society if we are going to maintain warming at or less than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level for the global average temperature of the surface of the Earth. There are parts of the world where we are already at 1.25 degrees of warming. So I just want to give you the background to why that global picture has influenced individuals and businesses and organisations so much that they've done things like this. A group of business people have got together, purchased land in wet West Wales, where it's a good place for restoring forest, and asked the question, what can we do to help? And that's what we're going to be learning about today. This business that is trying to restore natural woodland and lay carbon back into the soil. And in a few years' time, these fields are going to be forest. So I want to talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We get kind of bombarded with facts and figures sometimes in climate science, but I think these ones are particularly important. When I started my research and my life as a climate scientist and a geographer decades ago, probably let's say 20 years ago now, the idea of the CO2 level in the atmosphere ever being above 400 parts per mil was alien to me. My spreadsheet didn't go that far. We were at 390. This year, so a couple of days ago, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere was at 416 parts per mil. And that is an unimaginable concept for me. It is higher than at any time in the last 3 million years at least. And the key thing is not only how high it is, but how fast we have changed. There are times in the past, in the geological past, really only a couple of times when there have been big meteorite impacts where CO2, greenhouse gases and climate have changed rapidly. But that rapid was over decades and centuries. And the speed at which we've changed the greenhouse gas content of the atmosphere and the level that it's at, even for me, with sort of a couple of decades of history as a climate scientist, is unimaginable. We very often hear the phrase, we need to plant the right trees in the right places in order to use their carbon laying down capacity and enhance the ecosystem services. Trees are amazing. They release oxygen, they pull carbon down, they provide habitat for wildlife. We feel better when we are around trees. They slow down floodwaters as their roots kind of work their way through the soil. They transpire a massive amount of water back into the atmosphere. They're this real kind of green infrastructure trump card. They do everything. So the Carbon Community Project founders asked the question, well, what is the answer to that? Where is the best place to plant trees and what is the best place to enhance their growth? And they discovered that we don't know that yet. We don't have the research base for that. And so they decided to find out. They decided to set up a landscape scale project where they will trial different ways of planting trees using different ways of enhancing weathering and the carbon cycle to lay down as much carbon as possible. And the reason that that's important is because trees, about 50% of a tree's biomass is carbon, so they're a great way to draw carbon down. And they set up this experiment that will run across these fields that are behind me to answer that question, what is the best way to plant trees and what is the best way to lay down carbon? We often hear this phrase that we need to take our emissions down to net zero in the next few years. But when we think about those numbers, we start to be able to realise what a huge thing that is to achieve. Not only do we need to take emissions to zero, but after that, they also need to go negative. That's an absolutely huge ask. So what we need to do to achieve net zero in time to avoid dangerous climate change is reduce emissions in the next 10 years by the same amount that they've risen in the last 50 years. So in 30 years from now, emissions across the globe need to be at net zero. That's the same amount of time that we've been negotiating climate. So have a think about the likelihood of us achieving that. And even more than that, after 2050, our emissions need to go negative. So we desperately need these kinds of projects that are looking at how to get that carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the soil where it's needed. So one of the questions that we're going to be asking ourselves in this module is, why can't we just plant everywhere? Well, the landscape doesn't naturally have forest everywhere. And sometimes when you read about these schemes that sort of say, right, we're going to plant 3 billion trees and reverse climate change, they involve putting trees in places where it would not help either the environment or the climate to place trees. Think about the albedo, so the reflectivity of the surface of the Earth. Forests are dark. If we put forests on areas of the planet which are pale at the moment, some of the northern latitudes, savanna, we actually increase the amount of heat captured in the landscape and we impact the albedo feedback. So it's not straightforward. It's not simply a case of let's just forest everywhere. We really do need to figure out how to plant the right trees in the right places. In the UK in particular, one of the things that we've done in the past is plant on peatlands, on bog areas, which is really problematic because peat is actually a fantastic carbon sink already. There's huge amounts of carbon stored in peatland. And if we drain and dry bog surfaces in order to plant forest on them, we actually release carbon, and we also have a hugely negative impact on the biodiversity and on the wildlife in those landscapes. So thinking about where to plant and how to plant are two of the questions that they're addressing in this project. And they're really important if we're going to get these moves to reduce emissions and then take them negative right by enhancing the ecosystem services that tree planting offers. So we started at the top. We talked about the atmosphere and carbon and temperature. We talked about the trees. Now we're going to talk about the soil. Soil is everything in a forest. Over half the amount of carbon in a forest is actually in the soil. When we think about things like ancient woodland, it's not the trees that are ancient in ancient woodland, it's the soil. It's been undisturbed for a really long time. It has the fungal networks and the microorganisms that take years and decades and centuries to establish and give stability and richness and high biodiversity to the soil. So the soil is everything in establishing healthy, mature forest that has all the ecosystem services that we need. So one of the experimental plots here at the Carbon Community is all about actually transplanting ancient soils from ancient woodland into these plots to try and enhance how healthy those plots are. So that ancient soil will have the fungal networks, the mycorrhizal networks that are needed to form symbiotic relationships to feed the trees and to feed the soil. So they're trying to think about the best way. If you were going to make the best place for a forest in Wales, what would that look like? So one of the treatments that Charles talks about is putting crushed basalt rock on the soil, which might seem like a strange thing to do. But actually in the past, when we planted trees in tree pits, people would very often put crushed rock in the base of the tree pit. Rock has silica minerals in, it has all kinds of good things that trees need. And what you do when you crush the rock up and shove it in the bottom of the tree pit is actually have opportunities to enhance the weathering effect and to increase the amount of carbon capture and the amount of nutrients available to those trees. So this field, if we just have a look down here, has actually already had a treatment with crushed basalts put onto the land. And when these lines are then dug for tree planting, these trees will have that additional mineral component going into the soil to assist with growing. The other thing that they'll do here is, rather than use a piece of machinery that digs a little hole in order to plant, they'll do it carefully by just kind of flipping the soil over, popping a small sapling in and flipping it back. Because actually you have to be careful not to release carbon from the soil and release nutrients from the soil when you plant. If you disturb the soil too much, you're actually creating carbon release. So they've thought about everything from how they treat the land before they plant, to how they plant, and then how they support the growth of the forest. So at this site, we're talking a lot about little trees, young trees that they'll be planting here in their thousands to do forest creation. But actually, we need to think about some of the veteran trees that are in the landscape as well, to have a think about why trees are so important for our attempts to reverse dangerous climate change and to protect nature. Behind me, there's an absolutely beautiful veteran oak tree. This tree, once it reaches 300 or 400 years old, will be putting out over 200,000 litres of oxygen a year into the atmosphere. Oak in the UK supports over 2,000 different species because it's been in our landscapes for so long. It's co-evolved with lichens, with bugs, with fungus, with insects, with mosses, with liverworts and other kinds of bryophytes. It has this huge community of different ecological elements that associates with it. There are over 300 species just of lichen that are known to associate with oak trees. There's then all the different fungus in the root systems that also associate with this species. It's a really, really critical species for the ecology and the biodiversity of the UK. But the other thing is, when we look at trees like this, we can start to see why it's so important. There's over 20 different niches just within this veteran oak tree itself, where other wildlife can live, from the branches and the canopy to deadwood to rotten areas in the trunk to little pockets to different kinds of fungal colonies on the branches. So they really are this just amazing mini habitat in and of themselves. Veteran trees are really critical in the landscape, and we need to do really everything we can to protect them and to keep them there for as long as possible, as well as woodland creation. So when we think about everything that trees can do to help us in our missions to reverse dangerous climate change and to look after the environment, it's not just forest creation that's important, it's retaining the woodland that we have already. And when we think actually about what this one oak tree is doing for the environment and for us, it's kind of remarkable. So we're going to wrap up here by talking about the assignment that you're going to do for this field day. You've been asked to think about producing a report aimed at A-level geography students all about this site and the bigger issues here. And we need to bear in mind the 4 themes of this field module: heritage, landscape, community and environment. Because all of those themes really come together, they really kind of clash in this site. We talked a bit in the video about how the people who the land was purchased from to create this site, one of the older generation who had been on that farm and was selling it to this project said, "Oh, this land is too good for trees." Farming is a huge part of Wales's heritage, and if we're talking about landscape scale changes where we take land in Wales out of farming practice and convert it for nature, from whether that's pollinator meadows of wildflowers or forest creation, we are really changing the heritage and the farming and the agricultural history of Wales to do that. So how do we do that sensitively? What if people don't want to stop farming and don't want forest on their land? We then have all the issues of climate and environment, which almost are a little bit simpler. We then have all the issues around carbon and what it actually takes and what kind of an environment we need to create for trees to thrive in wet Welsh Wales on what was a farm. And we can think about landscape and heritage wrapped up in that. So what will you try and use your mind's eye to think about what this Welsh sheep farm is going to look like with a big scientific forest creation project on it? What are the issues that will bring up in people's minds in the community? Geography is about people, it's about places, it's about our planet. And we think in that 360-degree way when we think as geographers. So as we look at this assignment, think about how you're going to share all the different themes of this project with A-level geography students.